The sunlight was hiding behind the horizon, tinging the sky a deep orange as Cole drove his truck down the deserted road. The wheels turned softly, creating a familiar sound that calmed his weary mind. It was another long night on the lonely roads of the United States, where every mile seemed to drag, reflecting his state of mind. He had the feeling that life had lost its brightness. His wife had left him, his son was distant, and although work kept him busy, there was a void that money could not fill. As the road stretched before him, Cole thought of the promises of a better future that never came. He looked in the rearview mirror, seeing only the darkness approaching, and sighed, adjusting his cap to protect his eyes from the setting sun. The loneliness began to weigh, and he found himself wanting something more, a connection, a conversation, anything that would break the monotony. It was then that he saw a figure on the roadside. A man of worn appearance, with dirty clothes and a look that reflected both fatigue and despair. Cole hesitated, his instinct telling him to go straight through, but the memory of his own struggles made him hesitate. The heart of a trucker, accustomed to help, began to weigh. What if he is really in need, he thought. He stopped, the wheels of the truck stopping with a deft thump. The stranger approached quickly, a nervous smile forming on his sweaty face. "Thank you, man. I really need to get somewhere," the man said, his voice trembling slightly. Cole forced a smile and gestured for him to come in. As the stranger sat down on the bench next to him, Cole felt a shiver run through his spine. The tension hovered in the air, like a storm about to break. "What's your name?" asked Cole, trying to break the ice. "Rick," the man replied, looking down at the road ahead. The conversation started, but something about the way Rick looked at him made Cole feel like he might have made a risky choice. Cole turned the truck engine on again, and the roaring sound of the engine filled the silence. He looked at Rick, who was sitting on the bench, taking a deep breath as if he was catching his breath after a long run. The truck was slightly swaying in the road irregularities, and Cole tried to focus on keeping the direction. "So where are you going, Rick?" asked Cole, trying to keep the conversation light. "Far," replied Rick, his voice revealing a mixture of weariness and anxiety. "I just need to get out of this city. Things got complicated there." Cole raised an eyebrow, curious. "Complicated? What happened?" Rick hesitated, his hands clenching in his pants. "Just, things happen. It's not your business, right?" The defensive tone in Rick's voice made Cole feel a little uncomfortable. He was not a curious, but the way Rick seemed to hide something intrigued him. "Sure, I'm just asking," said Cole, keeping the tone friendly. He felt a pinch of mistrust, but also wanted to believe that he was helping someone in need. "I'm just trying to leave behind a past that I don't want to remember," Rick continued, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. "Sometimes life pushes us into paths we never thought we would go." Cole nodded, trying to show empathy, but his intuition alerted him. He remembered stories I had heard about people who stopped to help strangers and ended up getting into trouble. "Well, everyone has their struggles," said Cole, trying to change the subject. "I've been a trucker for years. Every trip is a new story. Have you ever had trouble with people on the road?" Rick asked, his eyes fixating on Cole as if he were evaluating the man next to him. "Nothing that can't be solved," Cole replied, laughing lightly. "But it's always good to be careful. People can be unpredictable." Rick smiled, but the glow in his eyes didn't seem genuine. The conversation continued, but an invisible tension grew between them, as if a storm was forming in the heavy clouds that were approaching. Cole tried to ignore the feeling, but the feeling that something was about to happen was undeniable. Finally, Cole turned his eyes to the road again. The sky was dark, and shadows began to spread over the track, making it more sinister. "Yeah, the road can be a lonely place, but it's also a safe place, or should be," he said with a slight nervous grin. "Safe?" Rick repeated, his voice now with a challenging tone. "Do you really believe you're safe here?" Cole felt a shiver at hearing those words, a sense that Rick's intentions were not as innocent as they seemed. The atmosphere inside the truck became heavy, and the dark clouds seemed to reflect the growing discomfort in Cole's chest. The road continued to extend in darkness, with only the lights of the truck lighting the way. The atmosphere became oppressive, and Cole felt the need to keep the conversation flowing, as if words could dispel the heavy mood. "What do you work with, Rick?" Cole asked, trying to keep the tone casual. Rick turned to him, eyes shining with unexpected intensity. "Not much. I work occasionally here and there, especially in jobs that don't require many questions." He smiled, but the smile did not reach his eyes. The cryptic answer made Cole frown. "I understand. It has its advantages, I suppose. But it's not an easy way to live." "Life is never easy, Cole," Rick replied, the darkest voice. "Just, some people don't have a choice." The tension in the cabin increased and Cole struggled to keep his cool. Well, everyone has their battles. I just try to move on, you know? The past is behind us. He looked at Rick, trying to decipher what was behind that piercing look. Do you really think you can leave the past behind? Rick questioned, his voice charged with a strange curiosity. What if he comes back to haunt you? Some things never go away. Cole hesitated, his heart racing. Look, we all have our demons. But we can't let them take over. Demons, huh? Rick repeated, his tone now more provocative. Some demons are more real than you think. Have you ever felt trapped in a place that you can't escape? Sometimes we all feel that, replied Cole, trying to deflect the unsettling tone of the conversation. But the road is my home. I can always go somewhere else. Rick had a dry laugh, making Cole feel uncomfortable. Trucks are not homes, Cole. You can change places, but what about what is inside of you? The atmosphere became even heavier, as if the air was charged with electricity. Cole tried to ignore the growing sense of danger, but Rick's expression, punctuated by shadows, left him alert. He pressed the steering wheel, tense muscles. If you have something to work out, maybe it's better to leave that in the past, Cole said, more as an attempt at self-assertion than advice. Rick turned to him, his look now cold and calculating. The past is not so easy to ignore, my friend. He always comes back to charge you. The depth of his voice seemed to echo in the cabin, making Cole's neck hairs rise. He looked out the window, the darkness outside seems to be approaching. Let's forget it. What matters is that we are here now. Rick leaned closer, the gloomy expression on his face. Do you really think you can escape? You may have more at stake than you think, Cole. Cole felt a chill in his spine. Something was about to happen and he didn't know how to prepare. Look, I'm just trying to help. If you don't feel comfortable, I can drop you anywhere. No. Rick interrupted, a crooked smile appearing on his lips. You've helped me a lot, Cole. Now I need something in return. Cole's heart popped. The mood had changed abruptly. What started as a generous ride now turned into something much more sinister. Cole felt the panic go up his throat like a fire out of control. The atmosphere in the cabin was suffocating, and Rick's words hovered in the air, laden with unspoken threats. What do you mean by that? He asked, trying to keep his voice steady, but the tremor was evident. Rick laughed softly, the laugh filled with contempt. You're more naive than you look, Cole. I thought you were smarter. You gave me a ride, and now it's time for me to take what I want. A biting cold has gripped Cole. Rick, this is not right. What are you planning? He turned partially to face the man beside him, his heart beating like a drum. The path ahead seemed to fade into a blur of shadows. You know, I really appreciated your hospitality, said Rick, sliding his hand under the bench and revealing a gleaming knife, its blades reflecting the light from the panel. But now, I need your truck and everything you have. Reality hit Cole like a punch in the stomach. You're kidding? You can't do that, he shouted, feeling the adrenaline burst in his veins. Rick leaned closer, his expression turning into a mix of pleasure and determination. Oh, I can. And if you don't cooperate, things will get pretty nasty. He held the knife firmly, and Cole saw the blade shine in the dim light. The truck swung as it passed through a hole in the road, and Cole realized he had only a few moments to act. He could not allow Rick to control the situation. With a quick movement, he turned the wheel, causing the truck to turn slightly to the right, while trying to divert the man's attention. Easy, Cole, Rick said, the voice soft, but the knife in his hand remained threatening. Just do what I say and it will be easier for you. No, Cole cried, squeezing the steering wheel hard. You're not going to steal from me, not like this. And then, in an act of despair, he accelerated, making the truck gain speed. The impact of the move surprised Rick. What are you doing? He shouted, trying to hold on. Cole leaned forward, the fury and adrenaline mixing. If you want this, you'll have to fight. He stepped on the gas, making the truck fly down the road. The wind whistled through the open windows as the speed increased. But Rick was not willing to give up. He threw himself forward, the knife shining, and hit Cole's arm, causing a wave of pain to pass through his body. Cole screamed but did not back down. In a quick move, he threw his arm back, hitting Rick's face, who lost balance for a moment. The fight inside the cabin became chaotic, with screams and curses mixed with the sound of the engine roaring. The truck was swinging as Cole tried to get rid of the pressure. The road was a blur ahead and he needed an exit. You'll regret it, Rick shouted, trying to stabilize himself, but Cole had one intention: get rid of that man at any cost. He could not allow fear to take over. Finally, in a stroke of luck, Cole managed to break free from the knife, which fell on the ground. He turned to Rick, his eyes shining with determination. "I won't let you control me." With a final push, Cole turned the wheel and in a desperate movement threw the truck to the side. The truck flipped over, spinning like a dervish on the road, as the impact of the crash threw the two men into a metal maelstrom and screams. The world around it became chaos, and all that Cole could think was, "Please let this be over." When the truck finally stopped, the world around Cole was in absolute silence, interrupted only by the distant sound of metal squeaking. The cabin was tangled, and he felt a sharp pain in his arm where Rick's blade had struck him. The shattered glass reflected the red lights of the signage, while night enveloped everything in heavy darkness. Cole struggled to move, his heart still racing. The impact had left him disoriented, but his mind was focused on one thing: Rick. He looked around, looking for any sign of the stranger, but the cabin was empty, and the silence was deafening. The fight had been intense, and he didn't know if Rick had managed to escape or if he was still there somewhere in the darkness. With a tremendous effort, Cole managed to open the truck door, feeling the pain radiate through his body. He crawled out, his eyes adapting to the darkness. The road was deserted, no car in sight, and trees stood like silent sentinels around it. "Rick?" Cole called but got no answer. The loneliness of the road was palpable, and the feeling of being watched made his skin shiver. The adrenaline began to give way, and he felt the weight of fear settle in his chest. He started walking slowly along the roadside, calling out Rick's name, but there was no sign of the man. The horror of the situation began to settle in his mind. He couldn't have gone away. Not so, thought Cole, doubt turning into panic. After a few minutes, when the moonlight began to illuminate the path, Cole saw something on the ground: Rick's knife, glistening under the silver light. He approached, the feeling of cold in his spine increasing. "That's not good," he muttered to himself. Deciding he had had enough of that night, Cole returned to the truck, his mind full of unanswered thoughts and questions. He could not stand there anymore, waiting for an invisible enemy. With difficulty, he managed to start the engine again. The noise of the engine breaking the silence of the night was comforting, and he went on, away from that place. As he drove, Cole reflected on the experience. Roads that once stood for freedom were now stained by a palpable fear. He had helped a stranger, and it almost cost him his life. The loneliness he sought had become a shadow, a constant reminder that even in the simplest situations danger could be lurking. The image of Rick, with his shining knife, remained engraved in his mind. "I won't forget this," he promised himself as the light of day began to crack the horizon. He didn't know what the future held for him, but he was sure that he would never stop to help a stranger on the road. Life would continue, but now a new darkness had settled in his heart. He was a trucker, a lonely traveler in a world that, although vast, could become very small and dangerous. And while driving, he knew that the real fight was just beginning. The night fell on the road, shrouded in a cloak of darkness, as Mark accelerated the truck along Route 29, a road known for its solitude and vast expanses of countryside. He was an experienced trucker, used to long trips and sleepless nights, but always found a certain tranquility in the long hours on the road. The dashboard lights flickered softly, creating an almost hypnotic atmosphere inside the cab, while the engine sound purred softly. Mark looked at the clock on board, 2:37 in the morning. He was only a few hours from home, and the idea of being on his couch watching a football game kept him alert. The coffee jars beside him were silent witnesses of his struggle against tiredness. He took a sip of the bitter liquid and refocused on the road ahead. The heat waves distorted the air around the truck, and the shadows danced on the sides of the road, created by the headlights that cut through the darkness. While driving, he tuned to the radio frequency where other truckers shared stories about the routes, some funny, some scary. One of them mentioned the Road of the Missing, a section of the road that many avoided after sunset. Mark laughed, disregarding superstition. At this point, the familiar noise of the radio was interrupted by an urgent message. Another truck driver, with a trembling voice, warned about an accident further ahead. "The road is closed. Follow the detour to Route 45, he said, his voice echoing with a mixture of worry and fear. Mark hesitated for a moment. He always trusted his instinct, and although he did not like to change his route, he did not want to get involved in a traffic jam. He adjusted the direction and followed the signs that would take him away from Route 29. As soon as you turned left on Route 45, the atmosphere around you changed. The trees were closer to the road, their shadowy silhouettes seeming to whisper as the truck passed by. The ground under the wheels became uneven, and the road was narrow and winding, surrounded by dense vegetation that seemed to swallow the light. Mark made a conscious effort to stay alert, though an involuntary shiver ran through his spine. As he continued to drive, he noticed that the signs of life were dissipating. The lights of farms and houses became rare, and the only sound besides the engine was the rustling wind in the trees. The truck's headlights lit up only a fraction of the way ahead, but the feeling of being watched began to grow. Something in the air was different, as if the road itself was alive, breathing, waiting. He then heard a noise. A whisper, perhaps, that seemed to come from outside the truck. Mark frowned, trying to locate the source of the sound. But the wind howled, and he soon decided it was just his mind playing with him. It's just fatigue, he thought, turning up the radio volume in the hope of keeping the disturbing thoughts away. However, as it went deeper into the road, the feeling of discomfort intensified. Something was wrong, and he could not get away from the idea that it should not be there. The road was narrowing more and more, and Mark began to feel a chill in his stomach, as if he were getting away from everything he knew. The path, covered with dry leaves and twigs, seemed to have been abandoned for decades. As he went forward, the sloping trees seemed to bend over him, as if they wanted to wrap the truck in their skeletal arms. He checked the GPS, but the screen just blinked blank. "Great, that can't be good," he whispered to himself, tapping lightly on the truck's dashboard. The radio was also unpicked, and the only company were the whispers of the wind. Frustrated, he tried to remember the last reference point he saw, but his memory seemed cloudy. Suddenly, the truck made a strange sound. A sharp clap came from the engine, and Mark felt the vehicle hesitate as if it was struggling to keep moving. He pressed the wheel harder, trying to ignore the growing anxiety inside him. Then the light on the panel began to flash, and he heard the sound of metal squeaking under pressure. "No, not now," he said, his voice a nervous whisper. The right-hand headlight began to fail, blinking intermittently. Mark breathed a sigh of relief when, in the distance, he saw the glow of a light in the darkness. It was a gas station, a comforting sight in the midst of despair. But as it approached, the brightness became less inviting. The post was poorly lit, with only a lamp hanging at the entrance, casting long and distorted shadows. Mark stopped the truck at the gas station and shut down the engine. The silence that followed seemed deafening. He opened the door and came down, feeling the cold night air. The smell of burning oil and smoke filled the air, and the place seemed abandoned, even if some lamps still flickered. Mark called, but no one answered. He looked around and noticed that the post was deserted, except for an old drink cooler that seemed to have seen better days. He decided that he needed a strong coffee to keep him awake. As I walked towards the main building, a sense of being observed began to intensify. He looked back, but there was no one. Only the silence of the night and the rustling of the leaves. The restlessness began to spring up inside him, but he forced his mind to calm down. "It's just an abandoned gas station," he thought. However, as soon as you entered the building, what you found was not what you expected. The interior was filled with old objects, dusty soda bottles, an old cash register covered in cobwebs, and a rocking chair that creaked slowly as if someone had just gotten up from it. The air was heavy, as if it was impregnated with forgotten memories. Mark went to the counter, but the coffee machine was off, and a layer of dust covered everything. He sighed, frustrated, and decided that it was not worth wasting any more time there. As he turned to leave, a sudden noise made him freeze. A sound of glass breaking echoed behind him. Cautiously, he turned and saw a shadow moving rapidly along the wall as if someone was hiding. "Who is there?" he screamed, but the only answer was silence. Mark's heart was beating fast, and he felt the adrenaline running through his veins. Desperate, he decided to go back to the truck. However, as soon as he left the building, something stopped him. The truck was with the door open, and he noticed that the cabin was full of something he did not recognize. A man's voice echoed in his mind, "Help me." He looked around, but there was no one. Despair grew, and the whisper intensified, now echoing in his mind. He was sure that it was not just fatigue. It was something more, something he could not see, but that was surrounding him. "It's nothing. It's just your head playing tricks," he said to himself as he tried to convince himself to get in the truck. But before he could do anything, the noise of footsteps behind him made his heart race. He turned slowly, expecting to see a figure emerging from the darkness, but found only the shadows that danced in the wind. Feeling lost, Mark turned to the truck, determined to escape from that cursed road. He entered the cabin, locked the door and started it, but something inside him knew that the night was still far from over. Mark squinted as he drove, trying to concentrate on the road ahead. The persistent whisper in his mind did not go away. He felt as if a presence was moving around him. The trees beside the road seemed to bend towards the truck, its long twists and turns almost touching the cab. The sound of the wind turned into incomprehensible murmurs, and the feeling of being observed became almost palpable. With each mile that he traveled, the apparitions began to manifest. First, it was just shadows, indistinct figures that seemed to move quickly between the trees. He wondered if they were just products of his tired mind, but with each movement the certainty that he was not alone grew. Mark shook his head, trying to ward off the disturbing sight, but when he looked again, a more definite figure appeared on the roadside. It was a woman wearing a dirty and tattered dress, with shaggy hair covering her face. She was standing, staring at the truck, her expression of despair and anguish making Mark's blood cold. He hesitated, his instinct to help fighting against fear. When he was about to stop, the woman disappeared in a blink of an eye, as if she had never been there. Fear took hold of him and he sped up, determined to leave the horrible image behind. But with each turn more figures appeared. Children playing by the side of the road, with empty eyes and distorted smiles, their laughter echoing macabre way as if they were mocking him. They ran and disappeared quickly in the forest, but not without first leaving a feeling of sadness and desolation in the air. Mark tried to ignore them, but the visions became more vivid and insistent. He saw men with torn clothes and expression of pain appearing among the trees. One of them seemed to be writhing as if he was caught in an invisible net. "Help us." His voice sounded like a lament, penetrating into Mark's heart. The expression of despair and suffering was so real that Mark had to wonder if he was hallucinating. Then the apparitions began to accumulate, forming a kind of dense fog around them. Mark felt surrounded as if he was driving through a nightmare. The shadows danced around the truck, and he could no longer distinguish reality from illusion. The forest seemed to be alive, its trees writhing and murmuring dark secrets. With the truck's headlights only a few meters ahead, Mark saw a familiar figure, almost comforting. An old friend of road, the same one who always found himself at stops. He was standing in the middle of the road, looking at Mark with a sad smile. "Mark, you shouldn't be here," he said in an empty tone. Mark felt paralyzed, unable to look away. But as soon as he approached, the friend disappeared in a cloud of smoke, leaving only a feeling of cold. Desperate, Mark began to accelerate, the road becoming a serpentine of fear and confusion. The voices and figures kept chasing him, calling him in unison, "Come back. You can't escape." The echo of his words seemed to cross his body, chilling his skin. He began to scream, trying to break free from that prison of terror. The truck shook, and he felt the pressure on his chest increase, as if being crushed by the guilt and despair of all those he had left behind. In a last effort, he turned the direction, leaving the road, hoping that change would take him away from those haunted visions. But the darkness around him seemed to intensify, and the whispers became screams echoing in his mind. He could no longer escape. What was haunting him was not just a shadow, but something much deeper and insidious, a reminder that the paths he chose in life can have terrible consequences, not only for himself but for everyone around him. Terror has taken hold of Mark as he struggles to keep control of the truck. The voices echoed in his mind, mixed with the screams and whispers of the figures he had seen. Every turn of the road seemed to take him deeper into an endless nightmare, and he felt like a prisoner, surrounded by an invisible force that pulled him into the abyss. When the truck stopped at a steep bend, Mark realized he was no longer alone. The gloomy figures he had seen before began to materialize around him, his expressions of despair and pain so vivid that he could not look away. He felt the pressure on his chest increase as reality distorted, his memories mixing with visions of the road. "Why don't you help us?" a female voice, deep and melancholy, cried. The woman in the tattered dress appeared again, this time closer, her eyes filled with tears. Mark remembered her expression, the sadness he felt when he saw her, and that made him feel guilty, as if he was somehow responsible for his suffering. Mark didn't know how to deal with it. He tried to shout, tried to answer, but the words failed. Instead, he felt paralyzed by guilt, remembering all the times when he ignored others, when he could have helped but preferred to go his own way. The figures began to approach, wrapping the truck in a dense fog. He turned the ignition key, but the engine just roared, refusing to start. Panic took hold of him. The feeling of being trapped, surrounded by those who sought help, became unbearable. "Let us go," he cried, but the answer was a chorus of laments echoing through the forest, and their presence became more and more oppressive. The atmosphere in the truck became heavy, as if each figure was pressing on it, pulling it out of the cab. Mark felt a penetrating cold, an invisible hand clutching his heart. He struggled to breathe, the air seeming to run out as the darkness enveloped him. Desperate, he took the lantern and began to light the cabin interior, hoping that the light would drive away the shadows. But the figures did not retreat. Instead, the light only revealed them in their true form: disfigured faces, lifeless eyes, expressions of eternal suffering. He saw missing truckers, friends he had lost along the road. "Mark, please, don't leave us here," a familiar voice called him. It was Tom, his old road partner, who had disappeared years ago. The guilt rose like a wave. Mark remembered when Tom helped him through a difficult time, and he had walked away, ignoring warnings about the dangers of the road. Now Tom was there asking for help, and he felt powerless to answer. "I can't," Mark shouted, but the pain in the voices around him only increased. The figures began to come even closer, and he had a feeling that they were trying to pull him out of the truck. The pressure on his chest intensified, and the cabin seemed to shrink around him. He knew he needed to act. With a sudden impulse, Mark let go of his seatbelt and turned to the door. "I won't leave you behind," declared, although his heart was racing and breathing, panting. He opened the door of the truck and went out, facing the darkness and voices that surrounded him. Mark felt a cold wave enveloping him as he stood in front of the fog. He needed to confront his fears, his guilt, and somehow free the spirits that followed him. "If you want help, tell me what I need to do," he cried, his voice echoing in the loneliness of the night. At that moment, the figures stopped, and a heavy silence hovered in the air. Mark looked around, the dense darkness around him, and felt that somehow he had broken the cycle. But the price he would have to pay to free himself and those around him was still uncertain. The shadows were waiting, and he needed to act quickly before the opportunity ran out. The silence after Mark's scream was deafening, as if the world itself had stopped to hear. He was surrounded by shadows, figures that represented not only the lost spirits but also his own failures and regrets. With his heart racing and breathing, he felt the weight of his actions piling on his shoulders, a load he could no longer bear. "If you want help, tell me what I need to do." His voice echoed in the night, resounding like a desperate cry for redemption. Fear was starting to blend in with determination, and Mark knew he had to face it head-on. The figures hesitated, their silhouettes wriggling in the mist. Mark saw their faces, their expressions of pain and despair, and the feeling of guilt grew inside him. He remembered Tom, his former partner, and how he had always been by his side even in the darkest moments. One of the faces stood out, the woman in the ragged dress. She approached, hands outstretched in a pleading gesture. "We are stuck, Mark. You must help us find peace," she said, her voice a soft echo but full of pain. "We are the forgotten, the ignored. You can't leave us here." Hearing those words, Mark felt a wave of understanding wash over him. That was not just a struggle against the apparitions. It was a confrontation with his own life. He had neglected the people around him, prioritizing his career and ambitions. Now, seeing these spirits begging for help, he realized that he needed to take responsibility for their actions. "How can I help you?" asked Mark, his voice now firmer. The figures around them began to move in unison, as if their determination was awakening something deep within them. "Tell me what you need." The woman raised her hand and pointed to the way back, toward the road he had left behind. "Come back, don't run away from your story. Confront your fears and help those who need you. Only then can we be free." Mark felt a wave of clarity. That's what he needed to do. He could no longer ignore the people who depended on him, who trusted him. The shadows began to move closer, and he could feel his cold hands almost touching his skin. But instead of backing away, he stood firm, determined to face his past. "Okay, I'll come back. I won't leave you behind," he shouted, heading back to the truck. The engine was still dead, but that didn't matter. He was determined to move on, even if he had to face the ghosts of his own life. As he entered the cabin, a feeling of warmth began to envelop him, as if the souls around him were united in their decision. He turned the ignition key, and to his surprise, the engine roared to life. The light from the dashboard illuminated the interior, and the headlights shone brightly, revealing the road ahead. With a new sense of purpose, Mark drove with determination towards the darkness that awaited him. He knew that by confronting his fears, he would not only help the lost spirits, but also free himself from the chains that held him to his past. The shadows began to dissipate as he steered, and the voices became less oppressive, as if the souls were finally finding their peace. "Thank you, Mark," the voices echoed in harmony, filling the air with a sense of relief and liberation. Mark went down the road, the darkness now softer, the fog dispersing around him. He felt that by accepting his story and responsibilities, he had finally broken the cycle of pain and despair. The apparitions were now only memories, and he was free to move on, determined to do better, to help those in need, both on the way and in his life. As Mark drove down the road that unfolded in front of him, morning light began to rise on the horizon, dispelling the shadows of night. The sky, a mixture of oranges and gold, symbolized a new beginning. He took a deep breath, feeling the freshness of the morning air enter his lungs, taking with him the weight of guilt that had oppressed him for so long. With each mile that I walked, the feeling of relief grew. The voices that had tormented him during the night were now only distant echoes, and the faces of lost souls slowly faded from his memory. He knew that he had made the right choice, facing the ghosts of his past and allowing them to find peace. This transforming experience not only freed the spirits, but also liberated him from his own chains. While driving, Mark reflected on his life. He realized that while the challenges he faced as a trucker were real, the real battles lay within him. He decided that he could no longer live selfishly, prioritizing only work and ambition. Instead, he has committed to being more present, helping those around him and valuing human connections. When he saw the city in the distance, he felt a wave of emotion. What was before was only a stop on his journey. Now it was a place where he could rebuild his life. Upon entering the city, he realized that the road was not just a physical path, but a metaphor for his inner journey, a path of growth, learning, and redemption. After parking the truck at a rest stop, Mark went out and looked around. He saw people laughing, talking, and helping each other. The human warmth enveloped him, and he smiled. He went to a group of truckers, feeling lighter than ever. As he joined them, he began to share stories, learning about their lives and, most importantly, listening to their struggles and joys. Mark was determined to be a positive presence in the lives of people around him. He promised himself that he would never again ignore the calls for help, and thus the cycle of pain and loneliness was broken. The road ahead of him was now lit up, full of opportunities and new experiences. Mark knew that despite the challenges that would come, he was ready to face them head-on, surrounded by friends and with an open heart. Mark's journey did not end there. It was only the beginning of a new chapter. And as he looked to the horizon, he knew that no matter where the road took him, he would not be alone. Jake drove for hours, the road lights passing like a blur in his tired vision. The panel of the truck showed that the dawn was advancing, and exhaustion began to weigh on his shoulders. He spotted a gas station by the side of the road and decided to stop. The need for a rest was undeniable. Parked next to the bomb and got out of the truck, stretching his arms and trying to scare off sleep. The post was almost empty with only a few lights on. Next to it, a small bar with a flashing sign open seemed to invite him. A beer could be exactly what he needed to relax before continuing the trip. He entered the bar and sat on the counter, observing the atmosphere. The smell of frying and soft lighting created a warm atmosphere. To his surprise, he saw an old friend of mine, Tom, sitting at a table in the background. Tom's face lit up when he saw Jake, and he gestured to join him. "Jake," exclaimed Tom, raising his hand. "It's been a while. How are you, my friend?" "Oh, you know how it is," Jake replied as he approached. "One more trip. Just trying to survive." The two exchanged some stories about life on the road, the difficulties and joys that accompanied each trip. But Jake felt a weight on his chest, something he could not ignore. After a few beers, the conversation flowed, and in a moment of vulnerability he decided to open his heart. "You know, Tom, I'm not well," started Jake, lower voice, almost a whisper. "Something happened, strange, and I don't know how to deal with it." Tom looked at him with concern, encouraging him to continue. Jake took a deep breath, preparing to vent. He never imagined the night would end like this, but felt he needed to share what had happened. "Remember the last trip I did? 3 days out. I was so tired. And then," he hesitated, words seemed heavy. "Then I got a call." Tom's expression changed, his curiosity evident. Jake knew he needed to tell, that he needed to be free of the weight of that experience that was tormenting him. It was a voice, a man asking for help. But the connection fell out and he stopped, the distant look. After that, everything started to fall apart. Jake smiled forcefully, trying to put the tension away as he watched the beer in his glass. But the memory of the trip back still haunted him. "Well, that's how it all started," he said, looking into Tom's eyes. "After making the delivery, I was so eager to get home. I had not slept at all and the trip was long. 3 days out, you know how it is. When I finally hit the road, fatigue was consuming me." Jake took a sip of the beer, the memories wrapping him like a mist. "The road seemed endless and I kept thinking how good life at home was. My dog, my mother's food, even the woman who works at the corner cafe was missing it. It's funny how we miss simple things when you're away." Tom nodded, understanding the longing that many truckers felt. "But by this time, I was so tired that it was hard to keep my eyes open. The radio only played those sad songs, and I wondered why I had not taken a hotel before coming back. The truth is that I was determined to get home that night. He paused for a moment, remembering the impulsive decision he had made. I sped up the truck, thinking that if I could get somewhere safe before sleep took me, everything would be fine. But, that's not how things work. The road started to feel different, longer and more empty. Jake paused while Tom listened carefully. At this point I was seeing things. Strange lights on the side of the road, shadows moving in the corner of my eyes. I tried to ignore it, but the feeling that something was wrong grew with every mile. When I finally realized it was too late, Tom leaned forward, the interest evident in his face. Then I got the first call. It was almost midnight. The phone vibrated in my pocket and I answered, hoping to hear the voice of my boss or some colleague. But instead I heard this voice. Jake hesitated again, chest squeezing as he remembered. It was a man very distressed. He asked for help, but I could not understand exactly what he said. The call broke down before I could ask more. I looked at the phone and thought maybe it was just a wrong call. He took a deep breath, the feelings of frustration and confusion flooding him. But then it started happening again. And again. Every hour that same number called me. The voice always asking for help. And what made me crazy was that every time I tried to call back, there was nothing. The number just didn't exist. Tom shook his head, not knowing what to say. The tension in the air was palpable. After a while I started feeling, I don't know, like the road was alive, like I was being pulled to something. And then, the voice started to appear again, but not by phone. It was no longer just a missed call. Jake looked into Tom's eyes, his gaze now full of worry and panic. The voice was inside the truck, right next to me. Jake took a sip of the beer, looking for courage to continue, while Tom's eyes did not turn away from him. When I realized that the voice was inside the truck, it was as if a frost had taken over me. At first, I thought I was going crazy, that fatigue was getting to me. But it wasn't just that. It was different. He remembered how the shadows inside the cabin seemed to dance in the dim light of the dashboard, and how he tried to concentrate on the road as his mind became a maze. The voice began to become clearer. Sometimes I heard her whispering things that made no sense, but at other times it seemed like she was calling me by name. Jake, I need you. It was like he was next to me, but when I looked there was nothing. Tom frowned, and Jake noticed the concern in his gaze. He continued, adrenaline running through his veins as he remembered every detail. I knew I had to stop, that I was putting myself at risk. I tried to stop at a gas station to rest, but even there I could not escape the voice. The attendants looked at me as if I were a lunatic. What was I going to say? That a voice was haunting me? They would never believe it. And with each mile I passed, I felt more lost. The shadows on the road seemed to come closer, and I began to see things that were not there. Sometimes I thought it was the road that was changing, as if it was taking me away from home. Jake rubbed his hand on his face, exhaustion weighing on him. He felt the need to vent, but also the fear that the words coming out of his mouth would not be enough to explain what he had really experienced. That's when I heard the voice again, and that was the turning point. It was so clear, so real. She wasn't just asking for my help. She was accusing me. Jake, you're guilty. It was as if I had done something terrible, something I could not remember. And then I realized that the voice wasn't just an echo in my head. Something much worse was happening. Tom leaned back, holding the beer, as Jake prepared to reveal the true essence of what he had experienced. I don't know how long I've spent driving like this, not knowing if what I was seeing was real or not, Jake continued, his voice trembling slightly. Every time the voice came out, I felt my heart racing. That's when I decided to stop again at another station, a stop to refuel. He remembered how he had entered the place, the blinding fluorescent light illuminating the dirty environment, the smell of oil and fresh coffee mixed in the air. While I was filling up, a guy came to me. He looked like a trucker like me, but there was something different about him. He looked at me and asked if I was okay. The voice I heard. Jake stopped, staring at the beer glass as if he could see the image of that night reflected in him. What do you mean? Tom asked, concern growing in his expression. It was as if he knew what was happening to me. And then, before I could answer, he approached further and whispered, "Watch your voice, Jake. It can take you to the bottom." The memory still made him uneasy. I was so confused. How did he know my name? What was that voice? Fear began to take over my mind. And yet, I went back to the truck and the voice was there again, more insistent than ever. Jake took another sip, the tension rising as he remembered the darkest moments of the journey. That's when it happened. I was driving, trying to concentrate on the road, when the voice became louder, almost screaming. "Jake, you need to help me." I almost lost control of the truck. The lights of other vehicles became blurry, and the world around me began to spin. He leaned forward, his eyes burning with emotion and terror. And then, I saw. It was not just the voice, I saw the figure. A shadow on the road, a silhouette moving, almost as if she was calling for help. My heart stopped for a moment. What was that? Tom's expression was fixed on Jake, stuck to the narrative, as if the air around him was thickened with tension. The figure disappeared when I looked directly at it, but I knew that it was not just an illusion. Something was calling me and I wasn't sure what. And that's when I realized, the road didn't take me home. Jake took a deep breath, his chest heavy with the weight of words that followed. The road was taking me to a place I never wanted to go. The voice was connected to something deeper, something I could not understand. And the sense of guilt was palpable. Tom was silent, the forgotten beer in his hands, absorbing every word. Jake wondered if he could understand. I needed to know what was going on. That's when I decided to change the way, thinking that if I avoided the main road, maybe all this would be over. But the voice did not give up. She kept echoing louder and louder, more insistent. And then finally, after driving for hours, I reached a crossroads. The image of the crossing in Jake's mind was clear. He paused for a moment, closing his eyes as if to block out memories. At that intersection, everything went dark. It was as if the night had swallowed up everything around me. And the voice, she was louder than ever, screaming for help, but it wasn't just that. It was an accusation. You let me die. Jake opened his eyes, the intensity of memory making his heart race. The moment I heard those words, I knew it wasn't just a stranger asking for help. There was something else, something I couldn't remember. Darkness gripped the truck and for a brief moment everything stopped. I was paralyzed, hearing the voice echoing in my mind. He remembered the cold that went up his spine, the feeling of being pulled into that darkness. Who are you? I cried but got no answer. The only thing I could hear was the deafening silence and the voice continuing to repeat. You let me die. Tom was silent, absorbing every word of Jake's, but his gaze showed a mixture of concern and curiosity. Then suddenly everything became clear. It was not just a lost voice, it was a memory that I had buried. I had been in an accident years ago, an accident that not only took the life of a driver but destroyed his family. The revelation fell on Jake as a colossal burden. He had not spoken about it to anyone, not even his wife. The weight of guilt was always there, but now it was as if the voice had brought everything back to life. I had done nothing to help that man and guilt consumed me. What I did that night was run away. I didn't stop. I kept driving, thinking that I could leave everything behind. But the truth is that the road would never let me go. Tears threatened to fall from Jake's eyes, but he forced himself to continue, to release what had been carried for so long. And that voice was the echo of the past, reminding me that I needed to face it. I couldn't just ignore what had happened. Tom, visibly moved, finally spoke. And what did you do? What happened next? Jake took a deep breath, the tension still beating in his body. I realized I had to do something. I needed to get back. So I stopped the truck at that intersection and decided I needed to face my demons. I didn't know what would happen, but I couldn't keep running. He remembered how he had hesitated, but finally took courage to turn around and return to the place where it all happened. When I arrived at the site, everything seemed different. The road seemed clearer and the weight on my shoulders began to decrease. I knew I needed to apologize. Not that it would change the past, but it was a way to free myself. The scene of the road and the accident drew in his mind, and he could almost hear the sounds of what happened on that fateful day. And then, in the middle of the night, while I was standing there, I heard the voice again. This time it wasn't an accusation. It was a whisper. Thank you for coming back. The revelation brought a relief that Jake didn't know he needed. He felt light, as if he had finally released the pain that haunted him. After that, everything was quiet. The voice was gone, and I finally got to understand that it wasn't just about what I did, but how I could live from that moment. He looked at Tom, his friend, feeling the tension in the air dissipate. I never thought I would have the courage to share this, but I did. The road can be a lonely place, but sometimes you have to face what is chasing you to find peace. Tom gave a slight smile, holding his hand on Jake's shoulder, a silent gesture of understanding and support. And now, what are you going to do? Jake looked out the road through the bar window, a new determination growing inside him. I will continue to drive, but now with a new purpose. No longer running away, but facing what comes before.